Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to today's practice session. We're going to go ahead and get started. All right, so here's an introduction slide that most of you are familiar with, but there's a cool new change this time. Pre-Med Peers, we're now officially a 501c3 nonprofit, in case you hadn't heard, so that's pretty exciting. So thanks to everyone who's been supporting us, and we hope we can continue helping bring accessible content in the future. As usual, if you have any questions, need any help with anything, you can reach out to us through Slack, email. Any of the tutors will be happy to respond. Sessions are recorded, like this one, so you'll have access to that afterwards. And yeah, if you have any questions or if you're not on our newsletter, feel free to drop that in the chat right now. All right, if not, we can move on, and feel free to use the chat throughout the session or unmute yourselves at any time. All right, so today's session, we're going to start with the pre-assigned passages. Two of those were over biochem and chemphys, and then we're going to go through some passages live. One is CARS, and the other is going to be PsycSoc. So we'll start with the biochem one. Let me go ahead and drop the link in the chat so you all have access to it. Okay. So here is just the overview of the passage, these 3 paragraphs, and then a diagram. So this passage was over nervous system, specifically it was over ALS. So let's take a look at the first question. So this question asks, where are the cell bodies of primary afferent 1A nerve cells involved in the spinal reflex arc located? So this requires a bit of knowledge of nervous system anatomy and knowing what a spinal reflex arc is. So if you want to, feel free to drop your answers in the chat. Otherwise, I can go ahead and just start walking through the correct answer. All right, yeah, so the correct answer here is D, the dorsal root ganglion. So the dorsal root ganglion is where the first order neurons are located, those 1A neurons. And the dorsal root is also, or the dorsal horn, is where your afferent sensory neurons are located. So again, that's afferent, which means it's going to the spinal cord. And so this is just something where you have to have knowledge of the different parts of the spinal cord and the spinal reflex arc. So in this case, the ventral horn, that's actually where your motor neurons are located. So that would be the efferent part of the pathway. The muscle spindles, those are talked about a little bit in the actual passage. And as you read them, you'll kind of understand that muscle spindles are sensory stress receptors. So they regulate muscle contraction and help with proprioception. And so the description given in the passage is a different function than what's asked in this question. And then C, amyotrophic lateral root. So that's like a bit of a distractor because it's talking about ALS, but there's amyotrophic actually means like loss of nourishment or loss of signal to muscles. So there is a part of the spinal cord that's referred to as the lateral horn or lateral root, but I don't believe amyotrophic lateral root is a thing. I might be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure. So yeah, that one's a bit of a distractor. So yeah, the correct answer here is D. Any questions over that? Okay, if not, we can move on. So I included a quick diagram here of the spinal reflex arc in case anyone would like to reference it. I think it shows pretty clearly what's going on and just helps to see things a little more clearly when they have this extra added diagram of what the reaction is here with your arm. So I can go over that in more detail if anyone wants, but otherwise, for the sake of time, we can just hop over to the next question. So in terms of their electrical activity, how do motor neurons produce more forceful muscle contractions relative to weaker muscle contractions? So again, feel free to drop your answer in the chat. Okay, so the answer here is D, increasing action potential firing rate. So This is what's referred to as temporal summation. Hopefully that's a familiar concept to most of you. If not, you can feel free to read up on that. So there's two types of summation, temporal and spatial, and that's what can cause more forceful muscle contraction to occur. As far as the other answer choices, so B, increasing action potential amplitude is not possible because like action potential is one of those all or nothing events. So it's a fixed change in the electrochemical potential, and you're not going to have an increased like amplitude or anything like that happening. There's no gradation there. For A, increasing the duration of nerve cell potassium channel activity. So if you'll recall, potassium channels are actually responsible for repolarization. I included here a diagram of an action potential graph. So as you see, potassium channels will open as that action potential peaks, and that will cause repolarization to occur. And so if potassium channel activity is increased or like the duration is longer, then in reality, you're actually going to have a slower response because it's going to be harder for the action potential to get over that threshold. Okay, and then the other one, let me go back for a second. So the other one, C, increasing the duration of voltage-gated sodium channel activity. Theoretically, that might work, but it's not, it might result in a faster response, but it's not the best option here. If you have read about temporal and spatial summation, you know that that's the more common way of that your body will react to things. This, I think, would require some sort of like drug intervention for C. So C is not the best answer here. Any questions over this? All right. Next question. Would a person's sense of proprioception be impacted by ALS? Why or why not? So feel free to drop your answers in the chat or unmute yourselves. So this question actually requires a bit of knowledge about first of all, what proprioception is. So that's kind of like bodily awareness or sense of your body's position in space. And the answer here is actually no. And the reason is because sensory neurons, as you'll read in the passage, sensory neurons are unaffected by ALS. And so those sensory neurons are what help maintain your sense of proprioception. So that's kind of what's important to make, the connection that's important to make here. That will help you rule out the other answer choices. Any questions over this? Okay. So the destruction of which level of motor neurons produces the exaggerated deep tendon reflex observed in ALS, and why? So again, this requires you to look back at the passage. So in this case, you can start by ruling out B and D, B and C, the lower motor neurons. And that's because if your lower motor neurons were destroyed, that would result in a decreased motor neuron response. So you can rule those two out, which leaves your upper motor neurons. And so you have to consider where would that exaggerated deep tendon reflex come from. So you can actually rule out D here because the gamma motor neurons here that are described are actually, gamma motor neurons are lower motor neurons if you read the passage in that last paragraph, which means that A is the only answer choice that makes sense here. Any questions over that? Okay, and then moving on to our last question then. What symptom would follow damage to gamma motor neurons and why? So if you'll remember gamma motor neurons or the gamma loop that's described in the passage, that is important for maintaining passive muscle tone. So if you think about it, the loss of passive muscle tone would result, therefore, in what's described here as flaccidity, right? Tonic contraction refers to like a sustained contraction. And so that's kind of the opposite of what you would expect if a gamma loop was present. So that's why you can cross out A and D. So you have to choose between B and C now. And the reason that you would pick B here is because just the only difference between the answer choices is sustained decreases versus sustained increases. So the reason that you cross out C is because it's kind of the opposite of what's being described in the question. Damage to gamma motor neurons would not really result in increased firing. It would result in decreased firing because that's what damage suggests. And so that's why you can come to the conclusion that B is the correct answer. All right, so those are all the questions from the BioBiochem passage from Khan Academy. Do we have any questions over that or questions over any of the concepts that came up? All right, sounds good. And if anyone watching the recording has questions, you can feel free to shoot me a Slack message. And for now, we'll move on to ChemPhys.
Okay, so the assigned passage for ChemPhys was about chemosynthesis from Jack Weston. And let me just grab the link. If you want to skip to the next slide, I'll just drop this in the chat. Okay, so I've just put the passage here for anybody watching the recordings or anybody, I mean, now just for our reference. You can click ahead. So the first question was, which of the following molecules has the greatest reduction potential? And if you want to click, this should all be. So the answer to this question was oxygen. And the explanation for this, you can click again, is from the passage. The passage describes an electron transport system with oxygen as the final electron acceptor, and this is reflected in the figure as well. So if you look at step 2 from the figure, you would see that oxygen is following kind of like an electron transport chain type sequence of reactions. So as the final electron acceptor, oxygen would have the highest reduction potential. Okay, so the next question was, which of the molecules mentioned in the passage has a bond angle of 109.5 degrees? And the answer to this question was D, SO4 2-. So in looking at these answer choices, if you want to click, so molecules with a bond angle of 109.5, that describes a tetrahedral geometry. So typically we think of that as 4 kind of things bonded to the central atom. So there's kind of 2 answers that could make you could consider here outside of SO4, which are NH3 and H2O. So NH3 has obviously 3 hydrogens, but it has a lone pair of electrons, and then water has 2, the oxygen has 2 hydrogens, and it has 2 lone pairs. So it still has kind of 4 things situated. They both have 4 things kind of situated around that central atom. But when you have lone pairs, they cause a decrease in the bond angle because they repel the other electrons that are forming the bond. So to get exactly 109.5, you actually need like 4 actual species bonded to the central atom, which is why SO4 is the right answer here. Any questions? Okay, we can keep going. So, oh, and I've put a little graphic from Jack Weston there to explain that. So you can see that, yeah, NH3 would be like the pink or orangish example, and water would be the green example. So they would be slightly less than 109. Okay. So the next question was, which of the following expressions describes the number of molecules of oxygen gas consumed when 123 grams of hydrosulfide is oxidized? So the answer to this question was B. And the explanation comes from kind of one line in the passage that tells you that 1 molecule of oxygen is consumed for every round of hydrosulfide oxidation. So this basically means that for every hydrosulfide you consume, you would produce, or sorry, for every 1 molecule of oxygen that you consume, you would produce 1 hydrosulfide like oxidation. So if you click again, yep, so for each mole of hydrogen sulfide, we need 1 mole of oxygen. So we calculate the number of moles of hydrogen sulfide or hydrosulfide that we are trying to oxidize, and that is 123 over 33. So that's the mass given to us divided by the molar mass. And then to get the number of molecules of oxygen, we would multiply this by Avogadro's number. So that's 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd. So that gives you answer B. Okay. So question 4 is kind of a redox question. So during the conversion of nitrate to ammonia, which of the following is true? So as you can tell by the answers, you have to look at the oxidation state of nitrogen. So it's mostly just calculating those oxidation states. So if you click the oxidation state of nitrogen in nitrate is going to be +5. Oh, yes, the answer is B. And then if you click another time, the math should come up. So yeah, so in nitrate, which is NO3, the way that I think about this is I just kind of look at the other atoms first. So in this case, I consider what oxygen is kind of contributing. So oxygen would be -6 because each one would be -2 times 3. And the ion overall is -1. So that means that nitrogen must be +5 oxidation state. In ammonia, hydrogen is going to kind of contribute +3. So that's like +1 times 3 hydrogens. And the molecule is neutral. So nitrogen must cancel that out. So it must be -3. So nitrogen is going from +5 to -3. And that matches answer B. Okay, so the next one is the forces between molecules of CO2 are most likely which of the following? The answer to this one is A, London dispersion only. And to answer this question, you have to think about the structure of CO2. So if you click, CO2 looks as pictured. And so because there's one carbon and it has a linear structure between those two oxygens, it's nonpolar and there is no permanent dipole in the molecule. And you can tell it has no hydrogens. So that rules out hydrogen bonding and dipole-dipole interactions and leaves induced dipole, which is London dispersion. So remember that when you're talking about dipole-dipole interactions, you're talking about molecules that have a permanent dipole. And so because CO2 does not have that, it has only London dispersion. Okay, the next one is which of the following is most likely true regarding the product of symbiont organic biomass during the Calvin-Benson cycle? For this one, there's kind of two notes that I've made. So if you click, the answer is A, non-spontaneous, and delta G is greater than 0. So a good test-taking tip is to immediately eliminate the answers that are incorrect on their own. So what I mean by that is if you look at B and D, B says non-spontaneous and delta G is less than 0, but we know that if delta G is less than 0, the reaction should be spontaneous. So we can automatically eliminate B because that's just wrong. And then the opposite is true for D, right? So D says spontaneous and delta G is greater than 0, and that just isn't possible. So we can eliminate those two. So then you basically just have to consider whether the reaction is non-spontaneous or spontaneous. And in the figure, it showed that the Calvin-Benson cycle requires ATP. So that, just implies that it requires energy input. So that tells us that it would be non-spontaneous and delta G must be greater than 0, giving us A. Okay, so there's one more. So researchers performed LC mass spec to produce a mass spec of the product of the Calvin-Benson cycle. Which of the following mass to charge ratios corresponds to doubly ionized glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate? So the key here is to notice that it says doubly ionized. So if you click, I think first the answer will come up. So yeah, so that is right. So the key here is that it's doubly ionized. So this means that the mass to charge ratio must be 2. So if you click again, click a few times maybe. So this is the structure of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. And we know that if it's doubly ionized, the mass to charge ratio should be 2. So the peak should be the mass of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, which is pictured here, divided by 2. So if you calculate the molar mass of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, you should get somewhere around 170. And if you divide that by 2, you should get 84. So the peak that we're concerned with would be the peak at 84. Any questions on any of those? And of course, if you have questions and you're watching the recording, you can just send a Slack message as well.
All right, thanks, Therese. So if that's all for the pre-assigned, we can move on to our in-session practice. So I'm going to go ahead and drop this link to a Jack Weston passage. I'm going to set a timer for 9 minutes, so please go ahead and go through this passage. It's about 6 questions. So yeah, 6 questions, 9 minutes, and then we'll reconvene and go over it together. Okay, so that's about 9 minutes. So it's okay if you're not finished. Just wrap up the passage. Um, and let's go ahead and go over it. So let me share my screen. Alrighty. So this is the passage that we just went over. This is called Tony Kushner. It's on Jack Weston. So this is how I highlighted the passage. Again, totally fine if your highlighting looks different. And again, just a few CARS tips that I like to use or strategies that work for me. I like to skim the questions beforehand, just so that I have a sense of what I'm looking for before I read the passage. And then I also like to sort of summarize, whether internally or on paper, what each paragraph is saying, so that when I go back through the passage, I know exactly where to look for what. So let's look at this first question. Suppose the author were asked to advise a playwright who wanted to write a play that others would see as influenced by Tony Kushner's work. Based on the passage, the author would probably recommend what? So this is one of those questions where you have to kind of figure out what is the defining characteristic of Tony Kushner's work, and based on the description given in the passage. So the correct answer here is going to be the correct answer here is going to be D. So utilizing religious imagery to tell a unique story. So this is the best answer because that's kind of what's being described here, in terms of Tony Kushner's piece, Angels in America, right? As far as the other ones, this is something that is not really discussed. Same with C. Like these two, I think, are pretty easily ruled out because they're very tangential to what is actually spoken about in this passage. And then B, critiquing a religious practice in their play. Again, this is something that is not really done in the passage. There's no critique of Mormonism. It's just sort of discussing where Tony Kushner got his inspiration from. All right, any questions over that? If not, we can go to the next one. So question 2, Tony Kushner's quoted analysis of Mormon theology rests on the assumption that what? So the question here is asking about, again, underlying passage assumptions. And so you have to sort of think about, again, what's sort of the main arguments in this passage and what is the what's being assumed here. And so the correct answer here is actually going to be A. And the reason for this, I think, is most clearly found over here in this quote. So again, Tony Kushner's quoted analysis, that kind of leads you to go automatically to quotation marks, and you find that here in paragraph 2. And you'll notice that one of the things that's mentioned is that Mormonism, there's this notion of an uninhabited world in which it's possible to reinvent. So that word reinvent really stuck out to me and made me think that A would be the correct answer. You can rule out B because it's, again, one of those things that's not really mentioned in the passage. I mean, it is mentioned, but it's not talked about or discussed in any depth. C is, again, it's not a basic assumption. It doesn't say whether or not the Book of Mormon is considered like fiction by Tony Kushner. And so you don't need to worry so much about that, or on Mormons believing that it's fiction. And then for D, this is a bit of an overreach. So I think that the idea that it's uniquely American, some people might, if they grew up in America, might automatically associate this statement of democracy and pursuit of happiness with that sentence. And so I think that this is a bit of a distractor, but a pretty obvious one probably. Just a reminder, I guess, to always put aside your own whatever biases or knowledge you may have beforehand. You always want to come into CARS as a clean slate, because that's how they try to trip you up. So any questions over this? Okay. Question 3, which of the following is most strongly suggested by the quote from Hannah Pitt in the passage? So that requires us to go to this last paragraph here, and there's a quote.
So her quote here is, "Our prophet, his desire made prayer, his prayer made an angel, the angel was real, I believe that." And then, "An angel is just a belief with wings and arms that can carry you. It's not to be afraid of. If it lets you down, reject it, seek for something new." So basically what I did was go through each answer choice and see, okay, were any of her words or statements supporting this or maybe contradicting this? So the idea that Mormonism is not a harsh religion, this is something that is not very, it's again, very tangential to what she's speaking about. So I kind of tentatively crossed that out. And then B, beliefs are not threatening. I remember here, see, it says an angel is just a belief, and then she says it's not to be afraid of. So that does seem like something that could be supported by the passage. C, a prophecy is not reducible to a belief. Again, this is something that she sort of says, our prophet has desired made prayer, prayer made an angel, etc., and then angel is just a belief. So there's sort of a link there which would almost contradict this, but again, when you find yourself having to really think and puzzle together different pieces, it's probably a sign that you're trying too hard to make something work. And that sort of overthinking, at least for me, oftentimes would lead me to the incorrect answer. So just again, one of those things where you can tentatively cross that out. B is still a better answer. And then D, angels do not actually exist. Again, she sort of says the angel was real here, so I think you can cross that one out because that seems to imply that this answer choice is not one that would be supported by her. So yeah, B is in fact the correct answer. And I think that these explanations are kind of similar, but I know that sometimes they can be a little brief. So hopefully going through that helped. Any questions over this one? Okay. So this question, what is the most likely explanation for why Kushner's plot differs from the original story of Joseph Smith and Moroni? So again, this is one of those questions where you kind of have to understand not just what's being talked about in the passage, but sort of understand like perspective taking, all that kind of stuff. So the answer here is actually going to be A. Kushner wanted to tell a story that had a different message than the Book of Mormon. And the reason for this is if you go to paragraph 5, I believe 5, yes, you'll notice that the way Kushner talks about his story, it's kind of the opposite of the message that is being given in the actual Book of Mormon. These two paragraphs sort of are contrasting the two. And again, he emphasizes the way that his texts are informed but not altered. Informed but are altered by it. And so you understand, like, he ultimately refuses the commands of the angel, all this sort of stuff that makes you think that, okay, Kushner was influenced, but not the same message. So yeah, that's why this answer choice would be the best one here. Again, work of fiction versus telling a true story, it was not talking about the truth or the falsehoods that were present in either story, anything like that. And then these two, again, are very, this one was not talked about at all or mentioned, whether he was a practicing Mormon or not. And then Joseph Smith did not succeed in his mission, again, tangential to what the question is asking. Any questions over this? Okay, if not, we can go to question 5. In paragraph 2, the author asserts that the Book of Mormon and Huckleberry Finn are both books that what? So this is the sentence that talks about that. And again, when it points to a specific piece or a specific part of the text, you want to make sure you read that sentence and then also maybe what's before and after. In this case, though, I think this is a pretty straightforward question because the only comparison that's really made in this sentence here is work of 19th century American fiction on the same scale of similar works such as Moby Dick and Huckleberry Finn. So we're not talking about religious significance. We're not talking about the characters. We're not talking about inspirations for the play. We're only talking about time period here. And so that's why C is the correct answer. Any questions on that? And again, this is one of those questions I think that requires you going in as a clean slate, because maybe you read Moby Dick or Huckleberry Finn in high school or something, or in college, and you have prior knowledge about what these characters are and how they tie into what the passage is describing, and you kind of have to be very aware of your precognitive biases and all these other conceptions that you come in with. So Cars is meant to take only what's given in the passage. All right. And last question, question 6. According to the passage, Prior Walter does not follow the directions of his angel because. So again, I think this one is a little more straightforward, but there's always distractor answer choices. So I think paragraph, paragraph 5 probably explains it the best. He ultimately refuses her commands and insists on a mission not fueled by a divine order. So I think you can cross out A pretty easily, and then B, similar, you can cross that one out. It's not that the task was difficult, it was that he doesn't care about divine order. And so you kind of lead to either C or D, disillusioned with Mormonism, or sought his own non-spiritual course of action. So I think the thing about these two answer choices, you kind of have to consider again which one is actually faithful to what the text is telling you, and which one here is a bit of an overreach. And in my opinion, C is a bit of an overreach because he wasn't disillusioned with Mormonism. Again, Mormonism is something that was definitely influencing this story here, but never was it explicitly said that he didn't care about Mormonism. It was just he doesn't want, again, mission to be fueled by divine order. So I think that is why D would make the most sense here. Okay, any questions over that or any other part of this passage? All right, if not, we can go on to our last passage, which is Psychsosh. Cerise, do you want to share your screen or should I?
Do you want to just share for now and I can switch right before we do questions? Is that okay?
Yeah, totally fine. All right, sounds good. So let me switch over to this tab. All right. So yeah, we have a Psychsosh passage. Cerise will lead us through that.
Yes, so let me drop the link in. Okay, so the link is in the chat. So I think for Psychsosh passages, let's budget. Let's do 7 minutes just because we're running a bit low on time. And it's a shorter passage. It's only 5 questions. So I'll allow 7 minutes and I'll set a timer. If you want to click ahead, the passage is also on the next slide, just if someone wants to read it there. But yeah, so I'll set a timer for 7 minutes. So we'll come back at 11:55. All right. Okay, so it's been about 7 minutes, so I can share my screen. Can you see this okay? Yeah.
Yep, it's visible.
Okay. All right, so this was a short-ish passage, so I'll just get right to it. So the first question was, which of the following results from a sibling study would most support the findings discussed in the final paragraph? So the answer to this question was C. There is no correlation between IQ and criminality in dizygotic twins raised together. And so kind of the piece of the passage that this question was referring to was the sentence here, which is, the researchers concluded that most of the association between IQ and criminality is due to confounding by childhood environment. So basically the goal of this question was to figure out how to kind of eliminate the goal, like how to eliminate the confounding environment. So answer C is the only one that does that. So if we want to eliminate confounding by the environment, we want to have two different people who are raised in the same environment to control for the effect of the environment. So that leads us to C. So between IQ and criminality in dizygotic twins, so these would be people who are genetically different. So if they're raised together, then that would support the findings that most of the association, if they were raised together but had no correlation, that would support the finding that most of the association between IQ and criminality is due to confounding by the environment. Okay, so I'll go to 2. So question 2 was, a researcher suggests that labeling theory may account for the association between IQ and criminality. So the answer to this one is A. Individuals with low IQ adopt the norms of an identity that is attributed to them. So labeling theory is kind of the theory that people adopt traits of an identity that is assigned to them. So with that in mind, you could immediately eliminate B and C because B and C specify the values of an identity that people choose for themselves. So I would eliminate B and C. And then the question is whether individuals with low IQ would be adopting the norms of an identity or the values of an identity. So in this case, those with a low IQ would be adopting criminal behavior. So that suggests that they adopt the norms of criminals, which is kind of the identity that is being assigned to them. This doesn't mean that they are adopting the values of this identity because there's kind of no way to get that from the passage. So the kind of the most we can infer is that they would be adopting the norms and the behavior, but we wouldn't be able to make a claim about their like internal state or their values. So that leads us to A. Okay, so 3 is, which of the following statements, if true, would weaken the hypothesis mentioned in the first paragraph? So the answer is D. And I've put here the hypothesis that they're referring to. So they're referring to the hypothesis, which is that the IQ crime link is mediated entirely by school adjustment problems. So it's that first sentence. So if we want to weaken this hypothesis, we want it to not be true, right? So we want something that suggests that the IQ crime link is not mediated entirely by school adjustment problems. So A and B don't answer this question, so we can rule those out. And so then we're down to C and D. And I say they don't answer this question because the hypothesis is about the IQ crime link or IQ. And school adjustment problems. It's not to do with individual socioeconomic status and school adjustment problems. So the correlations that are described in A and B wouldn't help us answer this question. So that leaves us with C and D. And D is the right answer because we want to show that the IQ crime link is not mediated entirely by school adjustment problems. So to do so, we could show that like a low IQ is related to higher criminality or vice versa, that high criminality is correlated with low IQ before school starts. So that would be option D, because a negative correlation describes like you increase one variable and that results in the decrease in another, or vice versa. So in this case, the answer is D. Any questions? Okay, so 4 was the tendency of the policymakers described in the final paragraph exemplifies which of the following? And the answer to this one was A, which is mental set. So the sentence that it's referring to is the sentence, policymakers failed to account for individual criminals' responsiveness to interventions to reduce recidivism, instead applying general interventions. So this definition from Britannica is that a mental set is a frame of mind involving a model that represents a problem or a procedure for problem solving. So when problem solvers have an entrenched mental set, they fixate on a strategy that would normally work well, but does not provide an effective solution to the particular problem at hand. So if you can remember this definition, then I think it's pretty clear that policymakers applying general interventions that may have worked in the past, but failing to, in the future account for individual criminals' responsiveness would show that they have like this mental set, and it's kind of like they're entrenched in this mindset. So that would describe their tendencies. I have the link for that definition, and actually that article also includes some information on functional fixedness and some of the other terms. So that's a good resource for these types of concepts. So the final question was, the dependent variable in the study is an example of which of the following? So the answer is A, and I'll just show the study that they're referring to is this longitudinal study conducted to study general cognitive ability with the incidence proportion of violent criminal convictions. So in this case, they're trying to link, again, like IQ to violent criminal convictions. So the first step is to identify the dependent variable. And in this case, the dependent variable would be incidence proportion of violent criminal convictions. So that would be an example of deviance. So all deviant behaviors break norms, but the difference here, so the kind of what you have to decide then is whether this deviance is formal or informal. So when choosing between these two, formal deviance breaks codified or explicitly expressed norms. So the classic example of that would be a law. So then breaking the law, which is implied here because they have criminal convictions, is formal deviance. So that would lead you to A. Okay, any questions on any of those? If not, thank you for coming, and you can always be reached at the email on the screen or also via Slack, and happy to answer any questions for those who are watching this recording at home, after the live session. Feel free to email or Slack your questions. Nisha, did you have anything to add?
Nope, that's all. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.